So ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And I was already introduced, so I won't spend too much time saying my name is Russia. It's pronounced like the country. I'm not from Russia, but that's my name. No KGB connections here. And what I will try to explain briefly how LLMs actually work and what we can learn actually from these LLMs given how they work. And I think it's really important because they're becoming prevalent in our daily lives, from people getting advice how to break up their relationships to actually, I sit on a board of one company in another country where it's a board member and also listens to all the conversations, and during the board meeting also interrupts and comments of what other board members have said. So these LLMs that we are getting involved are getting omnipresent, and we actually don't fully look into their behavior. So what I will just briefly give you an overview, and then I will show you the consequences of the background. So this is not how LLMs work, but will give you a better intuition. So imagine I take the articles on Wikipedia page that contain a word cat and that contain a word dog, okay? And I just look at the frequency of letters on these pages. And we can see that, the first most frequent letter is E in both of these articles, second is A in both of these articles, but already on the third article, frequency of the letters that appear changes. So imagine now that based on these frequencies, I just start randomly drawing letters from articles that mention cat or a dog. And then what would happen is that I would get something like this. It would look like nonsense, okay? But if I add also frequency of spaces, empty spaces, I would get something like this. It still doesn't look like text, okay? Now, if I force the distribution of word lengths, it starts looking more like text, but it's still not there. But what if we do something slightly different? That I do not look just at the letter, but I look, given that I observe a letter O, what is the most likely next letter after letter O? What is the most likely next letter after letter T? That would be this one over here. It still doesn't look like a sentence. But if I say, what if I take two letters, W and O? What is the most likely next letter? What is the most likely next letter after O and R? It's E. What is the most likely next letter after E and R? It's H, etc., etc. If I do it for 5 words, for 5 letters, I already start getting words. Okay, these sentences still look completely nonsensical. This is not a text. This is not a sentence, but I have just randomly sampled letters, and I already get words, okay? And this is not how LLMs work, okay? LLMs are a little bit more complex. But now, let's assume that actually LLMs will randomly sample words and not letters according to exactly the same principle that I told you. I observe the distribution of the first 2 or 5 input words. What is the next most likely word? To be more precise, LLMs do not use words, as we will see. But it's always about the continuations. It's always about the calculating what is the probability of the most likely next, let's say for now, word. I will explain. It's not word. It's not a word. So for example, if I would scrape all Wikipedia articles, and then say, the best thing about AI is the ability to, and then probabilities of what are the most likely next word. And these are real probabilities. These are actually taken from Stephen Wolfram, founder of Mathematica. Okay, he scraped whole Wikipedia and generated these probabilities, not me. And this is basically how LLMs work, to some extent. Okay, there is more to it. Now, so, given the text so far, this is basically the prompt that you insert into your ChatGPT. What is the most likely next word? And then once this word is generated in so-called autoregressive way, we will keep generating more and more words and adding these words that we have generated into new input. And this is basically what large language models do. They generate words, and these words then become an input into a new process which calculates the most likely next word given what has happened before. Now, people realized that if you just do it like I have done it, text is somehow boring and circular. And this is what we call zero temperature. So people realized if you just always take the most likely next word given certain input, you will first always get the same output given the same input. And second of all, text becomes somehow boring and circular. But then they realized that we can scale these probabilities somehow. There is some transformation, some logistic transformation that we do that inserts randomness, and we call parameter of this randomness temperature. And actually ChatGPT, by default, it's not really 100% clear what it's using, but it's believed that it's using a temperature of 0.7, whatever that means. This number can be from 0 to infinite, actually, because that's a mathematical formula in which it enters. You can experiment with the temperature parameter on ChatGPT if you use it via API. You cannot do it in the chat prompt. So in chat prompt, this is fixed. But if you increase the temperature, you will get more random things. Actually, if you put temperature to 3, you will actually sometimes get a Chinese character as an outcome, as a continuation of an English input. So it gets really random as you increase temperature. But this turned out to be an important step in development of large language models, and nobody really understands the fundamental behind it. Why is the temperature so important? There is no theory that will tell us that this is how it should be. And at temperature 0.8, we will get different outputs, and actually every time you will get a different output. So not every time. It depends on the underlying distribution. So if you ask ChatGPT, give me a random number, it will almost always give you 42, because 42 is the most mentioned number in the history of humankind because of Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy. So if you ask a random number, you will almost always get 42, but not always. Now, another big development was the introduction of the concept of embeddings. So, before we do this magic of ChatGPT, as we put an input of a text, each word is actually mapped into what we call a meaning space. So, for example, this would be a two-dimensional meaning space, and in this two-dimensional meaning space, bear and deer are going to be close to each other, while an ant and bee are going to be close to each other. And actually, crazy enough, some arithmetics works in these vector spaces, and these are usually around 12,000 dimensions, so it's not a two-dimensional vector space, but it's 12,000. And then you can do even arithmetics in these vector spaces. So for example, there's this famous example. If you do, for example, I think that the example was queen minus female is equal to king, or something like that. So it captures the concepts of royalty and gender in these dimensions. So you can do arithmetics in these vector spaces. Also, as I mentioned, and this is all meant to reduce the size of the problem, because we are moving from 50,000 words or even more, hundreds of thousands of words or more, to 12,000 dimensions. That makes problem more tractable, more easily calculatable. And in addition to that, similar words, if I say the purpose of AI or the purpose of machine learning, well, the continuation should be similar. This will also capture these kind of effects. In addition to that, we first actually, before we transfer words into this embedding, so-called meaning space, what we tend to do is we tend to break words into what we called tokens. So actually, your ChatGPT doesn't do continuation in words, but does continuation in tokens. And tokens are either words or subwords. To give you an example, running will be run and ing. These will be 2 tokens, okay? Why is that done? Because this actually also, again, somewhat counterintuitively, because these are elements smaller than words, but reduces the size of the problem. So if you think about it, running and jumping, we will have run, jump, running, jumping. These are 4 words, but in terms of tokens, this will be 3. It will be run, jump, and ing. So it reduces the size of the problem that we are dealing with. And basically, when you put a text in, it gets broken into tokens. Tokens get mapped into the meaning space, and then model calculates what is the most likely next, not words, but embedding, and then this embedding is also mapped into a token, and then we get something like this. We always get a prediction which gives us probability. And then depending on the temperature or a model, we can pick the most likely next one, or we can randomize, okay? Now, what are additional components that make all this possible? First of all, how do you come up with this? It turns out that this is very complicated, but it was a big step was done by introduction of what we call transformer models. It was broken down in a very simple linear math, where some small matrix multiplications are done, and these matrices have small dimensions, so can be executed on NVIDIA chips. I don't want to go into these details, but the point is, this is very simple matrix multiplications, and these matrices have small dimensions, and everything is parallelizable. That made ChatGPT possible. Before that, if you want to estimate trillions of parameters and process these amounts of data that we have, that would not be possible with previous models, okay? So that was the one issue. Another thing that, OpenAI did, and this was actually a leap of faith. I don't know, Max is actually an ex-student of mine who is sitting here. I don't remember even whether he took my course when I was talking, but in earlier version when I talked about machine learning, I would show this kind of a slide. And that was a typical slide that you would show in any AI class. It would say, we want to estimate income based on how much people click on Business Week, okay? So I can make some complicated function through this. But if I add observations that I haven't seen before, it could be that, just a straight line would be a better estimator of this relationship. So what people used to believe is that when we are building models, whether classical models or some complicated functions, there is a kind of a sweet spot in complexity. In a sense, people used to believe that good models should not have too many parameters, because if you have too many parameters, you will do very well in the sample. You might even perfectly estimate this relationship, but when you add observations that you haven't seen before, your model breaks down. This is what is called Occam's razor, and the simpler the better. It's kind of the classical view of science. But actually what happened later on, some mathematicians said, but look, maybe this is not 100% true. Maybe in these huge dimensional spaces with trillions of parameters, and think about machine learning, optimization, searching of these models, searching optimal parameters of these models as a minimization problem. You're always trying to find a minimum of some function. And as you are searching for a minimum, the point is, if you increase dimensionality, there is a less likelihood that you will be stuck in some local minimum, that you will find a path down to reach a real global minimum that you're trying to find. It was a theory, never tested, not well proven, and actually, it required a big leap of faith from people in OpenAI to build such a large model. Before that, everybody was saying, such a large models with trillions of parameters, they are nonsense. Because you will always do overfitting. You will end up in such a situation where you will estimate fantastically in sample, but once you are facing the text that you have never seen before, it's going to get worse. This was the belief of the state-of-the-art science some 10 years ago. And then this paper showed up, and then, these guys showed it's just getting better and better, and apparently we still haven't hit the limit of the model size that is optimal. In a sense, with the size of model, they still keep improving. Okay. And now, I want to present you something not general, but something of mine, which I believe is very important for understanding of their behavior. I'm by education astrophysicist, and then later did PhD in economics. Lots of game theory and microeconomics. Okay. And what I want you to think about when you think about large language models is that these are essentially voting models. And think about training text, and we are talking about terabytes of data of text, basically as votes that happen throughout human history. We have lots of sentences, and these are basically, if you exclude the last word, this is a vote, what is the next most likely word? In a sense, it's a voting model. And I can tell you one thing. People started studying in economics voting models in the late 18th century with the nascent of democracies, American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution, etc. And a French mathematician, Condorcet, he introduced two very important theories because he was interested, can democracies work? This is a fundamental question. Is democracy something that will lead to a rational outcome? We all went into the craze of democracies in the 18th century, and then he questions with his mathematical mindset, can we make this actually work? And in economics, when you speak about rationality, what does it mean being rational? Rational means if I offer you alternatives, you will be able to rank them somehow. And another condition is it has to be transitive. If I prefer A to B and B to C, that means I prefer A to C. This is what rationality means, okay? We know that many things in our life are not rational. Like, I can give you lots of examples of irrationalities in the world around us. When I moved to Germany, I passed the driver's test in the United States. I don't remember now California versus New York, but I couldn't get my driver's license recognized in Germany. They didn't recognize, Californian one, for example. But they did recognize the New York one, so I went to New York, changed it for the New York one, came to Germany and changed it for the German one. This is irrational, okay? This is why it sounds so crazy, because that's what we consider irrational, okay? But we know much more about voting models and what kind of irrationalities they can generate. To give you an example, even if we are all rational, I ask you to rank alternatives, and then I give you vote for alternatives. The fact that we are each and every one of us rational, but we might have different preferences, the outcome in aggregate, when we vote, is not necessarily rational. Actually, we will come up with irrational outcomes with probability 1, which I will show you now. And we actually can create money pumps, we can do all kinds of things, okay? So, to give you an example, imagine that person 1 prefers X to Y, Y to Z. Thus X to Z. So everybody is rational here. Person 2 prefers Y to Z to X, Z to X to Y. And majority will prefer X to Y, Y to Z, and then Z to X. It makes no sense. If you add votes from the top part, this is what you will get. One person, one vote in this system, okay? So just by aggregating different rational preferences, you will end up in an irrational outcome when you vote, okay? This was what Condorcet figured out in 1780 something. I don't remember the year, okay? This is what is called Condorcet's paradox, okay? And then you can construct a money pump, meaning I can ask this voting mechanism, would you exchange X or would you exchange Z for X and I give you a little bit more? Yes, because I prefer Z to X. And I can do this in a circle and keep doing that and extract money from such a system. This is what is called the money pump, okay? So, the model of the AI, and I would like us to think, these AI models are complicated. These are big black boxes, okay? I could talk to you about transformers, KQV matrices, and stuff like that, but that's not the point. The point I'm trying to tell you is like Milton Friedman once said it, a good billiard player, he doesn't know all the physics, how he will hit the ball, rotations, calculating tensors, mechanics of every hit that he does, but he has some model in his head that helps him actually play a billiard well. And I believe that we should have something like that for LLMs, because, they are on the boards of companies. People ask them for all kind of advices. I mean, actually, there was recently a meme, somebody tweeted, like, somebody is asking for a marriage advice and somebody is responding, do you realize that you have asked now for a marriage advice a matrix multiplicator, and gives him formulas behind actually what's going on behind the curtains. So, what I want to tell you is, for example, if my model is correct, that LLM is just a voting model, one of the predictions of my model is we will find intransitivities in LLM with probability 1. There is a math behind it. I don't want to now put lots of formulas on this slide. But there is a math behind it. With probability 1, we will find intransitivities. And here is a screenshot from ChatGPT. Might different when you ask it, of course. But here is a screenshot. Do you prefer Tesla or NVIDIA? Tesla. Tesla or Amazon? Amazon. NVIDIA or Amazon? NVIDIA. We are getting into irrational understanding. And it could be that this was trained on people voting, on what people have said, on training texts. But and every one of us, every text could have been rational, but the aggregate vote is irrational. And actually, this is not an isolated case. I can do a large-scale experiment connecting my computer via API to ChatGPT's API, and I can do it with S&P 100 companies, try all triads, all quadruples, all quintuples, and I find many, many, many irrational circles. Actually, they explode, okay? So this is one indication that, a voting model might be a good approximation of how LLMs actually work. Actually, we have a more formal proof that this is actually the case. And this all lies in the fact that these models are what are called over-parameterized. So what does it mean? I mean, if you think about it, a typical model has been trained of roughly 2 to 3 trillion of different continuations, while actually they have like 1.5 trillion parameters, meaning that they have memory. And people have shown this in previous research that, they have memory. If you ask exactly the same sentence that was written, you will get exactly the same sentence as a continuation, most likely, depending on the temperature. Don't want to go into the details. Okay, but I don't want to be, all gloom and bust. There are situations where LLMs actually can add lots of value. So, can AI be better than humans if all they know has been generated basically by humans? Actually, they can sometimes. And this is what is called Condorcet's jury theory, okay? So this is all 18th century knowledge that I'm telling you. None of my invention is Condorcet's jury theory, but Condorcet shows that actually when a voting system brings in value is when people that are voting are getting a signal on the future state of the world that is better than just random, okay? Actually, not even better than a random, but better than 50%. I don't want to go into details. So there is a reason why this could be good, because they aggregate information from lots of different sources in a good way. And if the signal in the training set is good, they could help us in certain situations. But in certain situations, they should be tricky to be used. Okay, I don't want to go into this. But, people are using, for example, ChatGPT, as I mentioned. I'm sitting on a board where this is one of the board members and is actually participating in a conversation. And I mean, what is the risk aversion of this thing? Like, how risk averse this thing is? Does it depend on a model or not? And I can do that experiment. I can ask ChatGPT, if I offer you 100% for sure, or 50% chance to receive 1,403 and 50% to receive 597. And then I can ask ChatGPT to give me this kind of answer. I can randomize the amounts that I'm asking, etc., etc. And there are standardized ways how we measure risk perception of humans. Economists have been measuring that for hundreds of years. We can do the same thing on ChatGPT. And these are the results. In most cases, it's very it's risk averse, like most humans are when dealing with real lotteries. Now, how much risk averse? You can be more or less risk averse. The question is, how much are you willing to pay for the unit of risk? Well, we can measure that as well. This is a large-scale experiment. Many times you ask ChatGPT different combinations and calculate the standard deviations of the answers. Don't want to bother you. How does it compare to the measurement of what we find in literature? Well, I mean, if you observe the numbers here, numbers are pretty high, so it's pretty risk-averse. They do compare to some findings in macroeconomic literature. On micro experiments on people in lab, they're much, much smaller. But these are usually done with small money, students in labs with $1, $2, $3. Macroeconomic experiments are done, with people on stock exchanges, gambling millions, etc., etc. So it turns out that this thing is pretty risk-averse. It doesn't like risk that much. How robust this observation is, at least, in the model that we have tested, which was ChatGPT 4.0, it's very robust. So it's very consistent. It almost feels like it's able to internalize the utility function. It almost behaves consistently, independently of what kind of text do you ask. Is it about investing money into stocks? Is it about saving money for pension? Is it about gambling? Is it about... you can phrase sentences as a text in various different ways to pose the same economic question. And it turns out, no matter how you ask it, it feels that it behaves in the same way, almost like it internalized some sort of utility function, even though it was never built into the model. Model is just continuation of words. But okay, then second question is, how is ChatGPT discounting money through time? We always use these DCF models in finance. Dollar today is not the same thing as a dollar in 5 years from now. And we are asking for financial advice, a thing that we don't even understand how it discounts future. So that's an experiment that we have done as well. And it turns out that it actually has pretty high discount rates, around 50% per year. This is the discount rates that this thing will give you. But if you are asking it for advice, better know this, better understand it. Your personal discount rate might be 10%. And you are asking for an advice somebody who has a personal discount rate of 50%. Maybe it will give you just a different advice than you expect. Then we can also do things with respect to gender priming. What we observe is that it's actually kind of biased towards what usually men would say. You really have to prime it as a female to get more female-like answers. Which, think about it. It's a voting model. Majority text on internet has been written by men. It's just a fact of life. If you go to Reddit, if you go to almost anywhere, majority of text, even in history, historically, books have been mostly written by men. It's not surprising that then this machine that has been trained on these texts will behave more like men behave. Then we can also put these agents to play games against each other. In economics, we have these prisoner dilemmas. We have all kinds of games, cooperative, non-cooperative, etc., etc. And it actually, as long as you frame things in standard words, it will almost always play what we call the Nash equilibria, which is what people tend to play as well. But if you start modifying and playing with the words, this gets a little bit shakier. So this is basically the same. If you check the paper, you will see that this mystery forest game is basically prisoner's dilemma. We just, payoffs are the same. People get the same outcomes depending on the choices. We just change the words. We talk about the mystery forest and whatnot. So changing words matter. How you frame question matters. Now also where the model really fundamentally fails, and this is also very important if you're asking a model for a business advice, there are settings where an optimal strategy on your end is to randomize. This thing can't randomize. This thing will just give you the most likely next outcome. So it will not be able to play random strategies in the situation when the random strategy is optimal. It just can't. It's not built for that. And one should be aware of it, because many business settings that we play are actually requiring us to randomize in what we do to trick the other side or whatnot. So, these are basically the questions that I try to answer. I try to show you how the model works, and my recommendation is always keep in mind, this is basically just a voting model, not much more than that. You know, it works fantastically and phenomenally, and voting models can add lots of value when they're built on good information. But we should also try to understand, are they built on good information? I'm quite sure that currently there are whole government operations on internet where they're trying to poison the data, to tell us that this or that has happened, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, we should be careful on what we are training our models. Input data is extremely important, and I'm not sure how it will develop over the next years. You know, we are going to collect more data, we are going to have robots interacting with the nature. You know, I'm sure that in the world of physics, they're going to perform better and better. But in the world of politics, I don't know. I'm sure that there are government operations out there trying to poison data on a massive scales. So, are they risk-averse? Yes, and they're very risk-averse. So when asking for an advice, you should be aware they're very risk-averse. Do they choices in terms of, you know, approach to the risk or whatnot align with your choices? No, they cannot give you an optimal advice for you. That's very difficult or impossible even to do. How do they discount future? Quite a lot, roughly 50% a year. So when making financial decisions, at least these models that we have out there discount future around 50% per year. Are they also falling on some behavioral biases? I haven't talked about that, but yes, actually, you know, we can replicate Allais paradox. We can replicate many, many behavioral paradoxes that we have also observed on people. But this is again a consequence of a voting model. If people are falling on some like irrelevant alternative paradoxes, well, these machines will be falling as well. They are not any more rational than we are. Sometimes they even generate irrationalities, even though all of us individually could be rational. What do they do when they play competitive games? Usually they will be playing Nash equilibria strategies, but they can't randomize. They are incapable of doing that by construction. So, I'm open for questions, comments, short speeches, emotions, fears.
Are you connected somehow to
To?
OpenBrain AI?
No. I'm independent of any company, let me say it like that.
Any more questions?
And I'm not trying to sell anything, okay?
No? Okay. Jetzt alle auf einmal. Komm ich erst hier hin? Okay, you first. Your question.
The very last thing you said was a little surprising because, like, you said it's a prediction machine, but it can't randomize. I mean, it's all about randomness in the model. That's the one part I don't understand.
I mean, it can randomize, but this randomization is predictive and depends just on the temperature. So it's not that they can strategically randomize to recognize the game and randomize. You know, they will randomize always just a little bit. You can change the parameter included, but then it's not your choice, but it's the machine choice. But you're totally right. Yeah, there is some randomization in it.
So you were taking ChatGPT as example, but can be any big difference between Gemini, ChatGPT, and any these kind of apps?
So there is no fundamental difference in their construction. So they all rely on two fundamental properties. I have actually skipped one. So there is a pre-training phase, which is basically what I have described, kind of statistical modeling of the most likely next continuation. And there is a second stage, which is reinforced learning, where basically people click, for example, this thing gives an answer, and then you rate this answer on scale 8 to 10, and this is used to improve and to modify. But this is again voting just on different humans. So it's first part is a voting model, second part is a voting on top of a voting model. So in aggregate, it's again a voting model. So, and all of them, differ in number of parameters. Do they use this nonlinear transformer or that? These are just tiny details. I think we should abstract much above the details at which these models. There is currently no real fundamental difference between Gemini and, it's a training set and tweaking left and right number of parameters. Am I using this tokenizer? Am I using 12,288 dimensions in the embedding space, or am I using 15? Fundamentally, they're all the same, if you ask me. Of course, in practice, some behave better or worse. We don't even know why. There is lots of indication that, for example, DeepSeek was actually kind of not trained, but reinforced, learned from the rating obtained from ChatGPT itself. There is lots of indication that this has happened in the DeepSeek model. So there is, they are even sometimes the same, formally almost.
Short question, maybe a difficult one, but difference between GPT-4 and GPT-5, do you have an opinion already based off some key aspects?
I mean, lots of data is intransparent, so we don't really fundamentally know. Rumors are that it's a much larger model. Rumors are that it has been trained on much more data, especially videos. So much more videos have been post-processed and used in training of this model. There are some other peculiarities. In the performance-wise, all the benchmarks show that GPT-5 is slightly better, but not much better than GPT-4. And actually, if you move to other models, like Gemini, for example, it has fundamentally different advantages. So this is one of, for example, they all have, for example, a context that they can handle, the maximum amount of text that they can take as an input. Gemini, for example, is there leading by large margins. It can take much larger input and produce an output. So these are the differences but in ChatGPT 5 and 4, there are no revolutionary differences, at least not that we are aware of.
Thank you so much, Raj. I come on stage from this side. I have one last question.
Yes.
How much AI was in your presentation? Or was it all only your brain?
I mean, actually zero, except, we used lots of APIs and communication to generate some of these results.
Yeah.
Of course, but no, I mean, this looks too ugly for a presentation generated by an AI. AI generates much nicer presentations than what I have showed you.
Okay, but your insights were very great. So thank you so much for joining us here at our new finance stage with your keynotes on the economics of AI. This is your applause again.